from the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Consider This, a program of issues and information behind today's news.
Surviving a disease that's killed over 400,000 people worldwide is cause for celebration. But surviving is not always the same as recovering.
Hi everyone, I'm Kathy Wyatt. Welcome to this week's edition of Consider This. Our topic, COVID-19 long hauler effects, an Omaha couple's personal journey a little later. First, joining us via Zoom to explain what those effects are is Dr. Angela Hewlett. Dr. Hewlett is the Associate Professor of Infectious Diseases at UNMC and Medical Director of the Nebraska Biocontainment Unit. She also directs the COVID Infectious Diseases Service at UNMC Nebraska Medicine. Thank you for taking the time to visit with us today, and welcome, Doctor.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start, most people who get COVID-19 experience mild illness. Just what does that mean?
So about 80% of people that have COVID, we think, generally have mild disease, and that could be a flu-like illness, anything from fevers, chills, cough, things like that, that generally they don't require hospitalization, don't need complex medical care. About 20% of people with COVID do go on to develop more severe disease and may require hospitalization, may need supplemental oxygen or other things. And then a subset of those individuals actually do go on to become critically ill, require ICU care, and potentially even die from COVID.
Let's talk about recovery time, Doctor. For that 80% that you mentioned, what are we looking at for most people?
Well, so this is highly variable, and we've seen people who, have such a wide variation in their symptoms. So some people may have no symptoms at all. Some people may have very mild symptoms and feel better after a couple of days of maybe some fatigue or some low-grade fevers. I would say probably the average people, it's like a flu-like illness. Most of the time people have a week or two where they feel poorly and then eventually recover over time. Although, as we're going to discuss in a minute, that's not true for everybody.
Yeah, that 20% that we're talking about topic today, long hauler effects. How do you explain those to people?
Well, so there's definitely some precedent for long post-viral syndromes with other illnesses. If we think about having mononucleosis, which is caused by Epstein-Barr virus, people can feel fatigued, and that's a classic viral illness where you don't get better typically after a week. You usually feel poorly for a while. We're seeing a lot of that with COVID, and I would say definitely more than we see with influenza and other typical viral illnesses. The effects can be long-lasting. They can last weeks to months. We don't know if the effects can last years yet because we don't have that much experience yet with the pandemic. But the long haulers tend to have persistent symptoms, which can range from relatively mild symptoms that are more annoying than anything else to actually really severe and symptoms that potentially can affect their lives and affect their ability to function. Some of those effects, things like the cardiovascular system is significantly affected. So we've seen people who go on to have high blood pressure that have never had high blood pressure before. We've seen a lot of strokes, heart attacks, clots, particularly pulmonary embolism, sometimes in otherwise healthy people. And then there are other sort of, interesting manifestations like neurologic problems, people with chronic headaches. It's been described as a so-called brain fog, where people that are normally very functional individuals are forgetting things and kind of having difficulty doing things that they're used to. And then also a significant amount of people do have a persistent respiratory illness, so things like a chronic cough, shortness of breath, maybe difficulty doing, getting upstairs and doing things that really didn't bother them before. And we've seen this from, these types of syndromes, even in people who had relatively mild cases of COVID to begin with, so not necessarily just in people who required hospitalization.
I want you to talk specifically to those people who are fearful of this virus, Doctor. Listening to you talk, there may be a common thread, there may not. It can come on suddenly, it may not. What would you tell those people who are already so concerned? Maybe they've had a loved one who has experienced this, and they really are genuinely fearful to even think about what you've just said, could add to that.
Yeah, I don't know how honestly to respond to that. I would say, we should all be a bit fearful of this virus, and we should really do everything we can to try to protect ourselves and our family members from acquiring the illness, because honestly, we don't know what category we're going to be in. We know that people that are older, people that have other medical problems have a higher likelihood of having more severe disease with COVID-19. But people who are otherwise young and healthy, I've seen a myriad of those individuals who get really, really sick, may require ICU care, have complications like heart attacks and strokes and things like that really shouldn't happen in that population. And so, this is a disease that affects people very differently. We don't really understand why. We think it has something to do with the immune system and probably other things that just haven't been determined yet. But, unfortunately, we're seeing a rising level of this in our community, a significant number of cases. And, a lot of us already know someone who's been in the hospital or who's even died from this. I know I do. And it's, this is a rough disease, and we all need to be very careful and do everything we can to try to prevent acquiring it.
Yeah, it's challenging at best, to say the least. What do you do in terms of treatments then, Dr. Hewlett? How do you approach that, knowing that each person comes to you with kind of a different scenario? What are you looking for when folks come in to make sure that you are demonstrating, exercising the best treatment possible for them?
Mm-hmm. Well, currently we have several research studies ongoing at UNMC and elsewhere looking at different therapeutic drug options for patients with severe COVID disease. And so these studies that were utilized in individuals who were hospitalized, so people with more severe disease, maybe difficulty breathing, things like that. What we are also potentially going to look at, and what I think would be very helpful, is to look at something we could give to people with milder disease that could possibly inhibit that progression, going on to more severe illness. If we had something that we could give to people when they're at home, when they first come on, have their onset of illness, that could potentially prevent them from needing hospitalization and that sort of thing, that would be incredibly beneficial. So right now there are some products that are under investigation. Everything is experimental though, and we really don't know enough about these experimental products to be able to utilize them in every patient. And so we're still learning a lot.
Yeah, and on top of that then, you have care plans. So people are there in the hospital with you, and those that are able to go home, are often questioning, when do I come back? How do I know if I'm supposed to come back? Maybe I'll never have to come back. So what are you and your team doing in terms of developing care plans that are about as individualized as they can be, given all the unknowns here?
Well, I think it's very important for people who are sick enough to be in the hospital in particular to make sure and know what are those warning signs to look for. If they're feeling better, they've been hospitalized for a couple of days and they're doing okay and are well enough to go home, what type of signs do they really need to watch for that could indicate worsening of disease or one of these complications that we've been discussing? The other thing that's very important is that they have appropriate follow-up with at least a primary care physician. Primary care physicians actually can help guide them along this path that may be in front of them, regarding some persistent symptoms. Right now, the only thing we really have for treating these persistent symptoms is really supportive care. So, things like the typical things you think about, body aches, you give some ibuprofen or some Tylenol, things like that. I mean, there are a variety of different manifestations that each may require some form of supportive care. And so it's really important that people that have COVID have a primary care physician to follow them along and make sure that they're well cared for, but then also be connected into the medical system enough to know, when what are those warning signs and when do we need to come back and seek a higher level of care.
Okay, I know one of the questions that the viewers are likely asking right now is, how are people like you and your team doing? We are seeing, signs all over the community, which is just beautiful that people are aware, even though we don't have any idea really what you're going through there. But I do know that the community is concerned and wondering how those of you on the inside are faring. Can you speak to those viewers?
Being a healthcare worker right now is tough. And it doesn't matter whether you're a doctor or a nurse or a respiratory therapist or, physical therapist, anybody in the healthcare environment, and in particular in the acute care environment as well as public health. This is a tough scenario. We've got, for instance, our hospital is full right now. We're full of regular patients as well. So, we typically run fairly full just because we do have a lot of patients, obviously, with heart attacks and strokes and other things that need care that are not COVID related. The issue that we have here is that if you add an additional number of COVID patients onto that already heavy load, it becomes very difficult for patients, particularly COVID patients who sometimes, they're not allowed visitors. Our patients in our regular environment have limits on their visitations as well. Wearing protective equipment all day long is strenuous and difficult, and it's not what we do normally. So I think that's what people don't understand. Our jobs normally are very busy. We're used to that. Healthcare workers are a resilient group of people, but this is taxing. It's taxing emotionally. It's taxing to see this many sick patients, in the hospital with a disease that, a transmissible disease like this. I've never seen anything like this in my career. I've seen a lot of really interesting viral infections. I've treated Ebola patients. Nothing to this scale. Nothing like what we're seeing now. And this is happening all across the United States and the world. Obviously, it's difficult, and there's a lot of stress, a lot of just a lot of really hard things going on right now, in the hospital environment. So my fellow healthcare workers and we're hanging in there, but it's tough. I'm not going to sugarcoat that in any way.
Yeah, Dr. Hewlett, what could we do to help you from out here?
You can do everything you can to stop the spread of this. If we decrease our number of community cases, we can decrease the number of people in the hospital, the number of people who become severely ill, the number of people who die from this. It's fairly simple. And, doing those things that we all hear about, wearing masks when you're around other people, trying not to don't gather in large groups, don't get together with extended family, without precautions. If you're going to get together, try to be outdoors when you do that. Wash your hands, stay home if you're sick, do all those things that you hear about. Because that really can stop the spread of COVID in our community, and then hence will subsequently decrease the number of people who get really sick and have to come in the hospital. And so that's what you can do to help us. And I do that myself within my own family. There's a lot of really tough things. We're all sick of this. We're all sick of COVID. We don't want to have it to disrupt our lives anymore. But unfortunately, we're not going to get out of this until we really, really buckle down and do the right thing. So I would ask, my fellow, community to do everything you can to try to control the spread of this. And that's what will help us.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hewlett. In just a few minutes, we're going to put a face to long hauler effects. What would you have to say about Steve Schrader?
Well, Mr. Schrader is a patient that was cared for at UNMC Nebraska Medicine. He was extremely critically ill with COVID while he was here. And actually, his illness was life-threatening, and he came very, very close to death, actually, directly from COVID. And, there were several days when it really looked like he was not going to make it. And he'll tell you about that. But that was obviously very scary for his family as well. And I know Mr. Schrader will be on the phone. But he eventually did improve, and he was discharged from the hospital. But I know he was very fortunate to survive, but he also continues to suffer some consequences, as a lot of people do, from his COVID infection. So I know, Eliza, we've been talking about a lot of people do suffer those persistent problems from COVID-19, and he is definitely in that category. But he's also a miracle in that he's here with us today.
Well, thank you for that introduction and for sharing your time and expertise with us today, and of course for everything that you and your team are doing behind the scenes. Before we leave you, we'd like to put up a graphic for our viewers in case they want more information. cdc.gov, that's 800-232-4636, dhhs.ne.gov, 833-998-2275, and finally, nebraskamed.com. That is 402-559-5600. Time now to meet Steve Schrader and his wife Ann, an Omaha couple. They are here via Zoom to share their personal journey through COVID-19. Welcome to the two of you.
Thank you.
You bet. Steve, I want to start with you. About a minute ago, Dr. Hewlett gave us an introduction, told us a little bit about you. Before we start this interview, is there anything you'd like to say to her and the team at UNMC Nebraska Medicine?
Well, the first word that comes to mind is thank you. Big thank you to UNMC and Nebraska Medicine for being a big part of my miracle, which I'm looking forward to sharing with you.
Okay, thank you. And it's been quite a journey, to say the least. Let's go back to the beginning and that day that everything changed. What do you remember about that day?
Wow. It was certainly a day I will never forget. And it's a very surreal day, but to sum it up, that day I went from sitting on the couch with my husband that morning to having him fight for his life on a ventilator that evening. So it was a crazy day. We had no idea he had COVID in the morning. Had the COVID test, they expedited it because his oxygen was so low. Told us to go immediately to Nebraska Medicine emergency room, which we did. I was not able to see Steve, had no idea he would be in there for more than a few hours, much less, over a month. And then to be told that he did in fact test positive for COVID and they were putting him on an ventilator right away.
I can't even begin to imagine and what you were going through in just what you have shared there, especially the not knowing, right? And then not being able to be there with him during what is likely the greatest uncertainty in your lives up to that point. Talk to us a little bit about how you were feeling, especially that evening.
Yeah, it was awful. I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It was awful because I wasn't able to give him a giant hug and a kiss and tell him I love him, before he went under. And that I really, really regretted and missed, but we just didn't know what the outcome was going to be at that point when I did in fact drop him off. So it was very scary, but I think in my mind I thought he might just be on the ventilator for a day or two, maybe, just to get his lungs better and get his oxygen up, and then he'll be fine. And little did I know he would spend the next 19 days on the ventilator.
Yeah, I was thinking, talking about those 3 weeks being bleak, I'm sure that doesn't even begin to describe it. So you're thinking, hey, this is just going to come and go. He's going to be okay. He's going to be able to come home with me. And then one day turns into 2 days, turns into a week, and so forth. How did you get through that, Anne?
It was tough. I was quarantined myself, so I was in my house by myself the whole time. But even though I was by myself, I tell people I didn't feel like I was alone because I had a lot of family and friends who were reaching out to me, on FaceTime, a lot of telephone calls. So I felt like I was talking to people a lot. But the people that I really wanted to talk to, besides Steve, obviously, was the medical professionals at Nebraska Medicine. So I would just, have my phone with me at all times, waiting for those phone calls, and also just hoping that the news coming out of their mouths would be really positive. And after a while it got to that point, but for the first week I was getting worse news as the days went by, and it was really bleak and very grim and very, very sad, very surreal for a while there.
Yeah, I've been talking with folks who've gone through this journey, and again, can't imagine, especially that time spent at home alone. What did you find to be the greatest challenge, knowing you as a person, knowing yourself as a person? What did you find to be the greatest challenge? Patience, understanding, again, you're kind of waiting for those calls from the hospital. You're not knowing. What did you learn? What did you discover about yourself over that 3 weeks?
Well, you're right. It took a lot of patience was probably the main thing because none of this was in my control. I could not control when I would be able to talk to the medical professionals. I couldn't control not being able to be with Steve or talk to him, see him. And so I found myself to be maybe more resourceful than I thought I was. I would ask them at any time if they could go in and put the phone up to Steve's ears so he could hear my voice. I sent a voice recording of my voice in a little mechanism I had ordered off of Amazon. I had that at the hospital, so they told me that they played that in his ear, when they would go into his room, because I kept hearing that, for patients who are in a coma, that they still might be able to hear, so that was, I just wanted him to hear my voice. I wanted him to hear the encouragement and the prayers coming from me, and hopefully that would, resonate a little bit with him.
That is beautiful. Steve, what was your first memory in the hospital?
Well, first memory was going into ER, and probably about 5 hours later, knowing that I had tested positive for COVID. And then after that, I didn't remember much else until I was at the med center for about 37 days overall. And I probably remember about the last 4, 100%. Prior to that, I had some, I called them dreams. They could have been hallucinations of where I was actually at, and would give answers accordingly. A lot of times I kept telling them I was in Colorado and at the med center. So it was, those were the first things that I remembered. I do remember also going through and doing the physical therapy as opposed to just laying in the bed, so I could actually mentally be doing some things too during that point in time.
And I was thankful, honestly, that he did not remember the majority of his time at Nebraska Medicine, because it was pretty traumatic what he went through.
Yeah. Steve, how are you doing today?
Today I've improved. I'm not 100% yet. I'm probably around 80%, I would say. But I've had other side effects that have happened, and I've had to make other trips back to the hospital. And as a label now, as a long hauler, some of those have been heart issues, nerve issues, tremors. Those are the big things that I've had to deal with, besides just getting your strength back and getting your endurance back with not using oxygen like I did when I first got home, and going through Madonna Rehabilitation Hospital too, for 2 weeks, and then 8 weeks of rehab after that. So
I would imagine that this has impacted your relationship for the better, probably cherishing each day. At the same turn, when you talk about this, Steve, you just don't know, right, you guys? I mean, from one day to the next, you don't know what this long hauler effects could bring.
yeah.
How is it
And
to live that way?
it's just constant where you, I think the biggest thing is you got to be aware of your own body and what it's telling you, and then proceed from there. When I left the Nebraska Medicine, I actually decided that I needed to have a internal medicine doctor, cardiologist, neurologist, and really utilize the professionals that they're trained in up there. And we also, I don't want to let out, a lot of prayers, and led to a miracle along with the Nebraska Medicine team that we had.
Yeah, I'm looking at you, Steve, and I just can't even imagine. I guess in the minute or so we have remaining, what got you through this?
Well, my wife was number one. You know, she was there, and whether I heard her or not, she was there. Second one was the power of prayer. And we had prayer groups all across the city, the nation, and even other countries that helped with the miracle that I lived through.
I want to ask the two of you, having gone through all of this and been able to be here today to share your story, thank you very much. What is your message to Nebraskans at this point about COVID-19?
I would say take this seriously. It's like Russian roulette. You don't know if you're going to be asymptomatic, have very mild symptoms, or be fighting for your life on a ventilator like Steve was. So it's not political. It doesn't care. This virus does not discriminate. So be careful, wear your mask, social distance, wash your hands. We have to stop the spread.
Steve?
And I concur with that, totally on that. I do believe that the biggest thing that we need to do is just, we don't know how it's going to affect our other loved ones. We may be fine with it and all that, but if you have grandparents or you have elderly or other family members that maybe are more vulnerable, whether they're diabetic or whether they're overweight, this can really affect them, and you need to look out for all of them.
Thank you both so much for being here today and sharing your story. God bless you both. Take care of each other. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank Dr. Hewlett and Stephen Ann Schrader for joining us, our students who are working so hard behind the scenes, and of course to all of you for watching. As we close, a look at scenes from Elmwood Park Golf Course as seen through the lens of Mars Johnson, a junior at UNO. We'll see you next week.
Consider This is an issues and information program produced by UNO Television. More information and program archives can be found at netnebraska.org/considerthis. If you'd like to share your comments about this program, call UNO Television at 402-554-2516 during regular business hours, or send an email to cwyatt@unomaha.edu.